I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political science professors who have just watched episode 6 of Pluribus, the Apple TV series from Vince Gilligan. We're here to give our fairly instant reactions, break down what we see as the key plot points, the key thematic elements. Jeff, episode 6, HDP, turns out that stands for human-derived protein.
It does. And I thought my quick takeaway from this week, I really liked this episode. I thought it was really smartly constructed. I thought it had a lot of movement to it, just sort of in terms of narrative structure. I really liked the movement from one setting to another. I really liked the reorientation of each section of the three parts of the episode around a different central character. So again, I think the show continues to be really smartly constructed and thought through. What did you think of this week's episode?
Absolutely fascinating episode. I noticed that it was, as you said, it's split into a 3-part structure, and I think that's maybe where we should start. Yeah. And it's focused around I think what are now the 3 central characters, especially since Zoji's kind of disappeared off the scene. Yeah. So you have the start with Carol, right, which kind of pays off last week's cliffhanger, which is Carol has discovered something. Yeah. What is it? And I think fairly unsurprisingly, it turns out that the Soylent Green predictions are correct.
Yes.
That the thing that's in the milk is people. And that, so that's kind of the first part of the episode. You've then got maybe the most substantial sort of middle chunk, which begins with Diabate, Kuma Diabate, who's in Las Vegas, living the life of Riley, or as it turns out, actually the life of James Bond.
Yes.
And then Carol comes and kind of meets him, and you have a long and important kind of segment there. And then the end part of the episode returns us to Manusus Oviedo in Paraguay, who I think a commenter had pointed out. I'd said Manusus Oviedo was testing radio frequencies looking for survivors. And a commenter had said, no, that's not what he's doing. He's scanning radio frequencies because he's looking for a form of communication amongst the members of the Pluribus. Because essentially, how is the hive mind connected? Yeah. Right? It can't be connected by the mind's electrical field or whatever, or telekinesis. That doesn't exist. Controversial statement. that doesn't exist. Tell us in the comments if that's true or not. But telekinesis, as far as we know, doesn't exist. The mind's electrical field only goes, not even as far as I am to you. They must be using some sort of radio wave or carrier wave, and I think that's what Manusus Oviedo finds. Whereupon he alights on essentially sort of a road trip. Yeah. A Mad Max style or the Road style or some other.
I mean, what's interesting about that part of the episode is that at the same moment that he finds the frequency, or at least seems to find the frequency, he is also finding one of Carol's videos, right? The first one, in fact, I think it's the first one, right, that she has sent. And so these two sort of plot points converge in Oviedo's storyline to sort of catapult him out of his survivalist-like isolation.
Right. And so that gives us, you'd made a really smart point, Jeff, which is the sort of genre play that's going on in Pluribus. Yeah. And there's sort of a meta-generic question and then a micro-generic question. The meta-generic question is the one that we've been wrestling with in all of these videos. And I think there are divergent readings of the text based upon what genre you think it's in. I've been reading it, and I think you have too, but correct me if I'm wrong, as a work of speculative fiction, and that carries with it a set of kind of ideological or normative understandings. One of which is it's going to be something that appears to be real or is in dialogue with our world, but is changed in some crucial way that shines a critical light on our world. The famous kind of Darko-Suvin concepts of cognitive estrangement, the world that's different from our own world, but contains the new thing, the novum that kind of renders our world in flux.
When we're high castle.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing. And the novum here is the hive mind or the pluribus. Yeah. Okay, that's how I'd been reading it. And from that standpoint, the characters in the show are going to be vectors for ideas rather than examples of psychological realism that are intended to be true to like real people or treated as real people and kind of rooted for or against. And there is a generic question as to whether we're right about that or whether it's really a literary show, a literary fiction show in which we should be on the side of some protagonists and against others protagonists and kind of judging them in moral ways. There's that generic question. And then the micro-generic question was contained within this episode. And I think this is your theory, Jeff, that the 3-part structure we've identified actually is Vince Gilligan playing with 3 different genres within even this one episode.
Yeah, I really liked this structural element. So the first third, it's not quite the first third, but maybe the first 10 minutes of this episode, the first act, I guess is the way to put it, which features, as you say, Carol kind of paying off last week's cliffhanger where she makes her big discovery. That is really, it's the found footage variant of the horror genre in which she is engaged. She's got the handheld camera. She is
shaky.
narrating. It's very shaky. At one point, she turns the camera on her own face. It's very obviously, it seems to me, a throwback to the Blair Witch Project and that entire kind of guerrilla genre of horror movies from the early part of
It was a
the
witch.
first
It wasn't a
century.
gorilla.
Thank you. Then we get, as you've alluded to already, we shift into the second act of this week's episode, and it is pure Casino Royale. It's pure James Bond, and
He's even got the white tux from Casino Royale.
And so in this portion of the episode, the character who is centered is not the last girl of the found footage horror genre, Carol.
Yeah.
In this case, but rather it's Diabate, it's James Bond, and it's James Bond amped up to cartoonish and ludicrously sort of self-absorbed heights.
I mean, he's already quite self-absorbed in the James Bond
There's
universe.
something about setting this character in Las Vegas that is exactly correct.
Right.
It's one of the funny things I thought about the portrayal, or the particularly ludicrous things about the portrayal of Diabate this week, is that his penthouse features these kinds of portraits of himself in various moments of repose.
Well, including in the bathroom.
And there's only one, we're only shown, I think, one portrait on the wall that is not of Diabate, and it's of the sort of Las Vegas era Elvis Presley,
Yes.
right? The monument to excess and self-regard and kind of larger than life figure in Elvis's career. So we've got this Casino Royale, and I think we'll probably talk a bit more about it. But here the character who is centered is the kind of the James Bond type super spy, although he's not actually a spy, Diabate. He's just kind of living the playboy, extreme playboy lifestyle. And then in the final chunk, the third act, we return to Oviedo. And here it's pure survivalist story. So here the reference are things like The Road, or even like The Last of Us, or any of those sort of post-apocalyptic shows that have become especially prominent over the last 20 years or so of American popular entertainment. And the character Oviedo, who we already know has kind of holed himself up in this gated self-storage office, leaves it, but it undertakes all of the aesthetic tones and elements of the classic survivalist story. And where does his story end for this week? Well, it ends with him, packing up his bags and lighting out in a broken down vehicle to travel a long way from Paraguay through whatever the land route is. I'm not sure if that's the Darien Gap. We were trying to figure this out off camera. I don't know if there is a roadway through the Darien Gap, but somehow he's going to be able to get via land to New Mexico.
Hopefully. I mean, his car doesn't seem
right
like the sturdiest steed to accomplish that.
Here, Oviedo becomes the classic kind of last survivor.
Mad Max or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, and presumably will face challenges along the way. And
One would think.
that I think is where it's going. Yeah, super interesting, and it does. This is a fictional show that is playing in a meta way with notions of fiction and
genre,
reality and genre in a very sort of riderly way. And I continue to think it's super significant that Carol is an author of fantastic fiction in herself, that she herself skewers her own fantastic fiction. She's not a sincere advocate of that kind of work. And that in that 3-act structure that you've just outlined, our 3 central characters are all sort of living a fictional fantasy of how to exist in this new situation, right? So Carol's kind of fictional fantasy is it has been like the detective, an Agatha Christie last week, and now it's including the kind of last girl trope. What's his name? Diabate's fantasy has been from the start a sort of international man of mystery, James Bond type of thing.
And such a fantasy is Diabate's imagination that he's literally play acting right, these scenes out of Casino Royale,
Yes.
including, as you noted, the really some of the same kinds of character archetypes from the Casino Royale Daniel Craig text. His main opponent at the table has only one functioning eye.
Right. Like Lashif had that kind of scar, didn't he? And that is a classic villain trope, right? The villain has to be marked,
Or
usually
profiled
facially.
or some,
Yeah, exactly. Well, and also he's instructed the members of the Pluribus to do this. Yeah. And it is very interesting. You'd said something last week that there was a hint that the Pluribus were not scared of Carol, but were sort of turned off by her. And there's also a hint that they're not really into Diabate's kind of fantasy, because when the Lashif character at the end takes off his mask, he looks kind of like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever. Even though he's part of a hive mind, he's not like this was fantastic. He's like, this is a waste of time. Let me now clean up the mess of your fantasy.
But it contrasts. It's a great point. That contrasts with the looks on their faces when they're doing the manual labor, which throws back, I think, to our first introduction of Sprouts, in which you've got like the happy worker, right, pose that's being adopted. All of a sudden, their faces brighten and little smiles creep in, and so it's a throwback to this kind of earlier element or your earlier theme in the show.
Yeah. So let's maybe go through the three acts, if you like, in order, and talk about those genre features and what they mean for the text going forward. I like the comparison. I hadn't thought of it. The found footage, thing was something you've brought to the table explicitly, but I really like it. The Blair Witch Project is the interesting reference, because Blair Witch was, you're right, the breakthrough text of what then became a very significant part of cinema, and especially horror cinema, the found footage thing. There've been, paranormal activities. There've been millions of things that have essentially copied Blair Witch. What's interesting, I think, about Blair Witch Project is it was the first of these things, and it's also tied to one of the thematics that seems to be going on in the show, which is this notion of like the internet and hyperconnectivity and so forth. Because Blair Witch, the internet was a different place at the time that hit, and it was sort of I think the first kind of viral extra cinematic text, or the way in which the internet and the cinematic text interacted. Because Blair Witch very famously had a website that posited that the Blair Witch things were real, right? It was a missing persons website, and that's where they deposited kind of extra textual elements. And but the internet was not sufficiently advanced either, maybe in form or people's consciousness, that you instantly debunked that. In fact, that this is real was sort of bolstered by the presence of the internet, because the internet was taken as a repository of true information. And so it is very interesting to think about what argument is Pluribus making about connectivity and the absolute, and social media and AI and all of those technical things that we've seen in the past. It's interesting to harken back to Blair Witch and to use that as a comparative commentary point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really sharp point, and it also throws us back to one of the very original points that emerged out of, I think it was our discussion of the first two episodes, that so much of what's happening here does appear to be a metaphor, or at least an analog to the forms of communication and connectivity that we live with on a daily basis now, where, through our devices, through the supercomputers that we carry around in our pockets, we connect literally with everyone in real time, in exactly the way that the hive mind is doing.
Right, and so the other thing I thought of when we discover what Carol's discovered, that it is Soylent Green, that the milk is in fact people, is she's discovered a plant. And what goes on in this plant? The plant isn't just a meat grinder, right? It's not feeding, crucially, I think, it's not feeding whole bodies into the process. It's atomizing people first, right? It's feeding body parts. It's cutting off heads, arms, all the rest of it. They're all neatly vacuum packed. So it's atomizing people, right? It's separating people. It's taking elements of them and removing from the whole person, rendering them into body parts. It's then processing them. Okay, and then it's feeding them back to the populace. Okay, so it's atomizing people, turn them into parts, process them, feeding them back to the populace. The effect of which is to create a single hive mind. Is to eradicate individuality and to create a populace that's quiescent and seemingly satisfied, but to Carol and to us as individuals watching it is only satisfied on a sort of surface level, right? It's consuming sort of junk calories, if you like, that sort of taste good, but they're not providing the kind of deeper nutrition that you would expect to get in individuals. So maybe this is too on the nose, but does that not continue the show's seeming metaphor about things like kind of data mining and surveillance capitalism, the way that feeds into the algorithmic curation of individual experience in the internet, which is increasingly synonymous or indistinguishable from the real world, and also, goes into the show's seeming metaphor about AI, what is a large language model, but taking whole things, disassembling them into decontextualizing parts, processing them and feeding them back to the population in a way that you ask it a question, it gives you an answer that is satisfying on a surface level, but is missing the kind of individuality that is really deeply nutritious. I mean, is that too on the nose, or is that what's going on there?
I think it may well be what's going on the nose, or maybe what's going on, and maybe it is going on the nose, literally. But I sort of get this feeling that we're not quite done with this storyline yet. I think there's a way in which it concludes so neatly, right? The HDP storyline concludes so neatly, or seems to conclude so neatly, when Diabate, it turns out, has already found out about this. But I just get the sense that there might be more to know about this. And it may well, in fact, revolve around the question of what is the actual function of using human additive to food products. Is it empty calories, as you suggest, or is there something essential and, in a way, nutritious about those human remains that are being added to the food mixture?
Well, I think your theory of this that we discussed, just briefly before we went on camera, is that I'd seen that as essentially a sinister project, that was taking people, atomizing them, decontextualizing them, and feeding them back to a populace that's kept kind of fat and dumb by them. You'd seen it instead as a metaphor for fiction writing.
Yeah. I mean, so I think,
I mean, do you want to unpack the metaphor a bit?
So in a way, that is kind of what happens when the audience puts itself in the role of a reader, I think, in particular, right? When we engage texts of fiction, what we're frequently doing is we are encountering composite personalities or composite characters who are themselves kind of stitched together, almost Frankenstein monster-like kinds of representations of actual personality types or actual figures. And we consume those things as audience members, as readers, as viewers, as an additive part of our lives. And so the question is, right, or I suppose the matter is, sometimes those kinds of texts that we consume become like empty calories. They do lead to this sort of, as you say, the sort of quiescent, pacified vision of intellectual engagement, which is actually not particularly nutritious or nurturing or long-lasting and connective with others. But sometimes that the audience's consumption of this sort of human composite is quite nutritious and quite enriching and is quite propelling when it comes to creating the sort of deeply engaged sets of intellectual and cultural connections that I think storytelling, that we both believe storytelling at its best can do.
So like fiction is a sort of an empathy machine.
Yeah. And so one wonders if it's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Which is kind of what leads me to wonder if this isn't the last that we've seen of a storyline dealing with the HTP, which would be a really nice head fake, right? See, here's the big reveal. Oh, but now it's over and we're going to move on to other stuff. Don't worry about that anymore. It just feels like there might be more to unpack.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then we move to Diabate's storyline. We move to Las Vegas. There's the obvious James Bond kind of Casino Royale analogy that's going on there. He's having the time of his life, Diabate, but it's a very strange. I don't know. Maybe it's only strange to me. Maybe there's people who'd really be into it. But it's a really strange fantasy that he has, and here's why I say it's strange. I mean, for two reasons. One is, like, it's hugely exploitative.
Yes.
Right, and I know the people whom Diabate is ordering around, which include hundreds of people just playing a role in his for his enjoyment in his James Bond kind of cosplay, but also include very specifically the women with whom he's having sex, and they're not really in their minds anymore, but their bodies are being used by him. There's no
They're waiting on him hand and foot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're sort of, I mean, is the Pluribus giving collective consent? But then how does that work out? I think there's something a commentator had said several weeks ago. How does that work out for the individual women? But then they're not really in their bodies, but they're being used by Diabate as bodies, in some sense, as decontextualized bodies, right? As sort of body parts rather than people. So they're being processed in a. It's not as literal a meat grinder as Act One, but his harem, I suppose, has that. That kind of valence to it. So it's a weird fantasy from that standpoint, and it's clearly not. This is clearly not quite a problem for him, or he hasn't. I don't know. It doesn't trouble him to a great extent. It's also a weird fantasy because his dream reality is one of extreme self-regard. Right. The portraits on the wall staring back at him. The cars that he has, Monday through Sunday, different, what were they, Ferraris or whatever?
Ferraris.
His peacocking type outfits and all the rest of it. I had always understood the trophy girlfriends that he has. I had always understood the pleasure of that would be the social regard that would confer upon you, right? People see you're hyper successful. What a guy, he's got 7 cars. What a guy, look at the girls that he's with. Here's all these portraits. What a successful person. But Diabate is the only person who would possibly care about that. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it's such an interior, but wouldn't that rob it of pleasure? It's like playing golf and cheating when you're playing against yourself.
Yeah.
Like what is the pleasure for that? You're the only person who's experiencing that. You're not getting social regard. In fact, the only social collectivity is the Pluribus, who are either obliged virally, biologically, to just do what you want, or we think it seems there are hints are actually finding you a little bit pathetic.
Right.
So what is his pleasure?
One of the things that strikes me that might be on point here is that Diabate's sort of toxic male fantasy, which is sort of put on display in the most grotesque and exaggerated of ways here, is actually, there's some story confusion within the James Bond universe, actually, now that I think about the presentation. So as we talk about, the Casino Royale is at first blush the appropriate Bond text, at least in regard to the card game. But actually, Diabate, the fantasy that he is enacting is the much earlier Sean Connery mid-century sort of toxic male fantasy than the later era Daniel Craig. And we actually, viewers might find, we did a pod with Professor Susan Burgess a couple of years ago on the different stages of masculinity that are on display over the course of the James Bond filmography. And one of her, really trenchant points that we spent a long time talking with her about was that the Craig era James Bond movies have a very different kind of masculinist valence than the earlier, both Roger Moore and especially the Sean Connery movies have. And Diabate, on one hand, we're given the fact scenario that points us to Casino Royale, this later different kind of punishing masculinity, as Professor Burgess calls it. But when it comes to the sort of off the card table action, it's pure Sean Connery, it's pure Playboy, it's pure toxic male fantasy, where the pleasure is fully and completely self-regarding. And so in that way, maybe this helps to unravel your puzzle, which is that in those Sean Connery texts, the pleasure that is being put on screen involves a character who's frequently not performing for social regard, but is portrayed as enjoying fantasies that are almost purely bodily in character, right? In the way that Diabate is portrayed in that sense as well.
There's a long conversation between Carol and Diabate that is sort of at the core of the episode. She brings him the revelation that the Pluribus are consuming people. He's like, yeah, I already knew that, because of course he'd ask John Cena, as you do.
So this is even more of the kind of confusion, because John Cena famously, as you had mentioned off screen, I mean, in one way it makes perfect sense. John Cena is famous for being a wrestler, for being a professional wrestler out of the professional wrestling world, in which the outcomes are predetermined. And so there's and with someone like Cena in particular, right, this big superstar, those big matches are choreographed really down to the move over the course of, and they're practiced over the course of several months, and they are really a kind of almost like a balletic sort of performance. And so to the extent that what Diabate is doing in the card game in particular is enacting and enforcing this kind of performance of an earlier projected fantasy, it makes perfect sense that he would turn to John Cena for his kind of avatar to narrate what's happening to the extent that it exists in the real world. But it's also interesting because Cena himself has kind of broken out of the professional wrestling world and is much more well known these days as an actor. And the types of roles that Cena has been cast in are very different. They're not the kind of toxic masculinist roles of the Sean Connery era of James Bond. They are these kind of more, I don't know, gentle warrior kinds of roles, the action hero who's a sensitive kind of figure as well. And so we've got this really interesting 20 minutes of this program, of this week's episode, that seem to be having a whole series of kind of inner filmic references that are sort of in collision with one another in really interesting and productive ways.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to come back to this. We just got to take a very quick break. And we are back with our discussion of episode 6 of Pluribus. In the midst of this summit that Carol has with Diabate, they talk about, I mean, Carol is trying to shock him, or he's trying to bring to Diabate the shocking revelation that the Pluribus are eating people. He's not shocked by that, but he shocks her because it turns out they've been having, the other survivors have been having sort of Zoom calls sort of without her. And I do think Carol is written, Carol's seen as a vector for satirical understandings of the human propensity for self-regard. has had some stunningly, I don't know, funny but also poignant and kind of tragic lines that show, to me at least, other readings are available, that she's been written in a way that is sending up that innate human propensity for literally existing within your own body and your own mind, because that's what a human is. That's one of the core problematics of the show, dichotomies of the show, is we can only really be individuals however much we might try and coexist collectively, and once you move beyond that individuality, you're into a very problematic, even doomed collectivity. So last week, the line I thought that was sending up that innate human trait was when Carol says, "I made the whole world cry, and they evacuated a whole city just to be away from me, and that proves I'm on the right track." And that's a tragic stanza. Until the last line where she says, "and that proves I'm on the right track," which of course has this delicious double meaning of I'm solving the mystery, but also is this kind of satirization of the way that individuals can exist within a collectivity. And then I thought the satirization this week was when Diabate says that they're consuming the milk, the HDP, or John Cena explains, they're consuming this in order to erase a caloric deficit, but it's not working. And the whole population is going to starve to death in 10 years.
Yeah.
And Carol says, "But wait, you're on Zoom calls? Didn't you think about including me in the Zoom calls?" Which is such a deliberate mismatch of stakes there that I think it's intended to be satirical.
Yeah, I think it's intended to be satirical, but also what you said earlier, a bit tragic.
Right.
So I actually think we get a slightly different portrayal of Carol this week, which is what Diabate sort of intuits. And when he's talking on the phone to the Pluribus, he says she's lonely. She's so lonely, right? And we get that. And Carol is trying to connect with Diabate, actually. And, she said, he asks her what her plans are, now that she's sort of made it to Las Vegas. And she says, "Well, I'm going to get a suite here, and then I'll catch up with you later to plan." And he makes clear, it becomes clear that he's not actually interested in that.
Right.
He was just being, it was this kind of facade of kindness, or this facade of care and empathy. And Carol immediately recognizes what's happened, and she sort of snaps back into the, oh, I was just kidding.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not going to hang around here. But there are these moments where it seems as though we're getting a slightly different portrayal of Carol this week, which point to the something else that's deeply human and individual, which is the eventual need for connection. And so I think that's what's going on with the Zoom stuff, right? Like, she probably doesn't really want to be like substantively a part of these Zoom conversations. Like, I mean, we know that she doesn't think much of anything of the other survivors, but it's the feeling of being left out, right? Which just seems to compound the isolation, her isolation, which is growing and growing and growing. That appears to be the sort of the key emotional turn, right? In that set of scenes.
Yeah, and this needs to have an arc on both sides, right? Because in terms of the Pluribus learning about individuality and Carol learning how to connect, authentically with or exist in a wider culture. Because if it doesn't, Carol keeps saying things like, "I want to put the world back the way it was," or that was a better world, which would portray her as and I'm just speaking in generic terms here, which would portray her as a small c conservative pro status quo, anti-utopian actor, certainly in the science fiction problematic. Whereas, it's in most science fiction, you're tending towards, you shake up the existing world, you introduce the novum in order to prompt reflection on its inadequacies and to produce a new world, and they've produced antithesis and thesis here, right? Thesis and antithesis, Carol and the Pluribus, and you need to move towards some kind of synthesis.
Yeah.
So maybe, the Pluribus is learning that the types of connection that it's forming are ultimately non-nutritious, or ultimately insufficiently nutritious. And Carol is also learning that she can't just be solely rejectionist of the, so both sides need to, maybe that's the resolution that they're moving towards, but both sides alter,
that would be a really interesting sort of narrative conclusion.
Yeah, but both of which not taken literally. Carol is in this sense standing in as an avatar for the inherent individualism of humanity, and the Pluribus is standing in for the inherent need, the individual as a just biologically a social animal, as in need of that kind of connection.
Yeah, and they're extreme archetypes of each.
Right, exactly. So maybe that's going on. All right, so. Again, a really great episode, really sort of interesting in ideological terms. I did think it was interesting that Carol brought up again that she writes fiction, and that the reason she should be included on the Zoom calls is, they were talking about, we thought about robotic farming to satisfy the caloric deficit. She's like, robots, I could think up stuff like that all day long. Again, maybe another sort of meta hint. Carol had a nice hit on Las Vegas as a $1 trillion light-up ashtray. Diabate had a nice riposte, which is, you're right, it's no Albuquerque. we couldn't comment on either, being here in sunny Storrs, Connecticut. but nonetheless, a great episode. Yeah. We, as always, we value the interaction that you give us in the comments. We have. And we've tried to be explicit. We try every week, but we've tried especially this week, to be explicit. What are the conceptual lenses that we're working towards. We're also explicit that we don't consume other media or understandings of the show, and we don't have time to think for a long time or really talk for a long time about what the show is. That's why we call these reactions rather than, I don't know, analyses or deep dives, or, there are instant thoughts. So we do rely on people in the comment section to bring to us different frames. We always find it useful, whether you agree with us or disagree with us. Do let us know what you thought of this week's episode, of our analysis, and of the show in general. But on that bombshell,